All right, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Security Boulevard webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. I am so excited about this webinar. We are going to be talking about in identity and access management, and I have two very, very smart people here with me to have that conversation. But before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for any of us, please don't wait, don't hesitate. Just use your question and answer interface there, tab on your interface and submit your question. And we're going to try and answer questions as we go along. And if we have a whole lot of questions, then we'll try and do a question and answer period near the end of today's presentation. We are also, at the end of today's webinar, going to be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you will be one of our 4 lucky winners. And if you have any comments for our speakers during today's presentation, we have an interactive chat feature. So please feel free to chat us up whenever you feel like it. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Managing Security in a Decentralized World. Our speakers today, in addition to myself, are Mike Rago, who is the cloud security expert at Cloud Knox Security. Hey, Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great. And we also have Rob McDonald, who's Director of Solutions Marketing at Micro Focus. Hey, Rob, thanks for joining me today. How are you?
Doing good. Thanks for having me.
All right, great. So as I said before, I'm really excited about our conversation we're about to have. And before we do get started with it, just a quick reminder to the audience, we have an infographic that is going to accompany today's webinar on this topic. We're not going to be giving it to you today during the webinar, but as soon as it is available, we're going to follow up in an email to you to get the infographic over to you. Okay, so with that, let me just take this title slide off so we can all see ourselves a little bit better. And we just lost Mike here. Hopefully he'll be rejoining us very soon. There he is. How are you doing?
We all panicked, Mike.
That's right. No,
Sorry,
so as I said,
had an incoming call.
No, that's all right. As I said at the top of the hour, we are going to be talking about identity and access management. And it's a topic that obviously is integral to so many organizations. It's part of their security strategies, and especially in those organizations that increasingly are using multi-cloud or hybrid infrastructure environments. It's an integral technology. A lot of organizations are using identity and access management, but I think especially within the last year, as so many organizations have really increased their digital transformation efforts as a result of the pandemic. They've had to increase their remote work efforts, if they even had one beforehand, or just do what they needed to do to improve their customer experience overall and their user experience. Identity and access management has become a larger part of the conversation. So with that, we wanted to take a look at the topic again and really talk about what the market is seeing for identity and access management now. What are some of the trends, and what are some of the things that organizations perhaps need to keep in mind when they're talking about identity and access management as part of their security strategy. So Rob and Mike, I want to kind of open it up to you guys and talk about kind of maybe setting the stage, if you will, for identity and access management in this kind of brave new world of digital transformation and integrated hybrid cloud, multi-cloud environments. So Rob, why don't we start with you? What are you kind of in an overall sense, what are you seeing in the identity and access management space happening right now?
Yeah, there's a lot of things actually. Identity and access management is still a hot topic, right? We've been talking about identity and access management for 30 plus years now, and here we are. We're still talking about it today. It's still kind of core to any security infrastructure. It's a foundational element. We need to have a good sense in terms of who's accessing or trying to access or who's doing what, within the ecosystem at any given time, so we can provide that level of security that we need to provide as an IT organization. On top of that, IT is kind of moving to the center of the organization, becoming kind of a competitive differentiator. They're being leaned on a little bit heavier to leverage the identity ecosystem, to apply it to customers and a bunch of other stuff. So it continues to be central and core to any kind of security best practice. We're moving into things like risk-based, adaptive, user behavior analytics, artificial intelligence. Those are kind of all the newish and new stuff that's coming down the road as well. We'll probably talk a bit about that today. But to get security done right, you need to start at identity. It's the starting point, and then after that, you can start to add on whatever you want to. And if you try to step outside of that and do something else that doesn't consider the identity portion of it, then you're going to set yourself up to fail potentially. Identity should be core. I'm an identity guy, but at the end of the day, it should be core to any kind of security ecosystem. And if you're not looking at it from that vein, then you open yourself to potential risks.
Okay. Mike, what are you seeing in the space, particularly as it results to, as it applies to, say, the last, 12 months or so since we kind of entered this, the pandemic phase, and digital transformation efforts have stepped up considerably. What do you think has been happening with the space? How has it kind of been impacted by this rush to digital transformation?
So yeah, it's really interesting to see the pace at which people are adopting the cloud now. And because of that, it's sort of an interesting inflection point, which kind of has a few interesting factors to it. That is, as we've got this quick pace of everybody moving to the cloud, everyone's trying to move those workloads and adapt to how they provide access in the cloud. We're also seeing at the same token, we're seeing, people think about, how do I think deeper about protecting, my resources in the cloud? And, what kind of things do I really need to think about? People have really thought about that initially from a perimeter perspective, but now we're sort of in the second evolution of that, where people are starting to think about access and how do I manage that? How do I provide access? How do I understand all those new types of permissions that exist within that provide all of that access? It's a lot of new technology to consume. It's a lot to understand, and it's a whole new level of sophistication, but also we're moving at an increasing pace. When we think about where we were 25 years ago, when people were deploying, security technologies, you had different teams responsible for all of those, items, whether it be building servers and the network and the operating system and the databases, all done by different teams through separation of duties. Now in the cloud, you can spin up that same type of access in the stack in 15 minutes or less. So the pace at which we're moving, the level of sophistication, and who has access to that are all critical things that people are thinking about today.
Well, it seems to me that because of that, because, to your point, we have different people doing, a lot of many hands basically in the security pot, if you will. It seems to me that, now we need to be placing a greater emphasis on who has access to certain, levels of information, and just being able to log on to the network and have the right types of permissions. And I would think that would be even more not only critical, but difficult for many organizations to kind of get a handle on, with so many people doing so many different things these days. And just the fact that the landscape, what they consider what they need to actually lock down has become much more vast than it has been in the past. So Mike, with that in mind, what are we going to do? I mean, what can organizations do? Mike, are you able to hear me?
Got choppy all of a sudden.
Yeah, I think well, Robert, why don't I go ahead and turn it over to you, and then maybe you can answer the question before hopefully we'll get Mike back very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, listen, at the end of the day, you need to eliminate as many silos as possible, right? Silos are in my opinion, and being in this industry for a while,
I think as we think about this, this that's going on in the cloud, and the pace at which and what can people do about it. I think people are thinking more about automation. They're thinking about taking what and how they may be managing that manually today and leveraging automation. Yep, I'm maybe okay.
You there?
Okay, Mike, I think you're, for some reason, your connection became unstable. So I'm wondering if you might be able to join via a phone audio instead. I'm not quite sure why you're having these technical issues, but
it was great just before we started.
Yeah, it was going great, and then all of a sudden it didn't. Which is kind of the way life works, right? Everything goes great until it doesn't. So.
Yeah, speaking of everybody working remotely, this is exactly what happens, right? It's
right.
Oh, yes, the technology is awesome, only when it works.
Exactly, exactly. So, Robert, again, why don't we go ahead and pick up from there, and then I see Mike is returning to us, but Mike, are you there? We can see you. Okay, can you hear us? Okay.
Yep, I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep. There we go. Okay. All right. So we heard part of your answer. So I don't know if you want to start again. Sorry, guys, for these technical situations. It's like I said, technology is your friend until it's not. So.
Yeah. So if you guys can hear me okay,
we can hear you.
What we're saying was, I think as we think about how people are managing, this fast pace, this move to the cloud, this work from home, all of this is kind of moving from how they may be manually managing that today, moving more and more to automation. With the level of sophistication we have in the cloud, with the pace at which people are spinning up stacks, deploying applications, providing that access, when you've got thousands of permissions in the cloud and this level of sophistication and pace, the automation that can be leveraged across all the technology that's provided definitely provides a kind of a cleaner way of managing that, leveraging things such as, AI and machine learning to really automate a lot of those tasks. And as a result, really start to incorporate additional layers of security. For example, thinking about how we provide access, understanding, how can I get to kind of a zero trust, least privileges type of approach and leverage that automation to calculate that and give you a much more accurate way in which you manage access and provide that access.
Okay. Robert, do you have anything that you'd like to add on to that?
Yeah, listen, automation is going to be the way of the future. At the end of the day, there's not enough people to manage the ecosystem or the infrastructure as it is now. And there's also a drain in terms of skill set or expertise or knowledge, where we don't have experts in particular platforms like we used to, right? I mean, we still have people that are very knowledgeable about the technologies, but we don't have tracks that you can go down to become a certified whatever. That's not the way it used to be, or not. It's not the way it used to be. So that automation component is going to be critical, and the easier you can make it for organizations to stand stuff up and manage, the better. The more they'll take on, but that needs to have some sort of all automated element to it. Same thing goes for the day-to-day management of it. There needs to be an automation component to it, so they can free themselves up to look for, anomalies or fix gaps or identify gaps or whatever that may be. An automation in terms of how they can kind of draw that baseline in terms of what their desired state is, so they can then look for the deviations from that norm. Then we can get into things like artificial intelligence and behavior analytics to help do that, which again is another level of that automation and intelligence. I'll talk about that a little bit later on, but trying to bring the organization, like I said earlier, break down some of those silos, get things managed from a central location, things like policies and stuff along those lines. So there's a single version of that truth that is then kind of sent out to the rest of the organization. So we know that the policy that's on a Windows box is the same that's on a Unix or a Linux box. Even though they're written in different languages, they're still managed from a central location and applied in the same way, regardless of what the platform type is. Those are the things that we're seeing that organizations are starting to pay attention to. Because again, it's about finding those gaps and those holes and addressing them before somebody else finds it and exploits it, right? Because we all know the bad guys are looking for that next thing, and some of those things are those next things. Automation is going to help a lot with that.
All right, great. So are you guys seeing automation being adopted more by organizations and maybe especially within the last year or so, or is this more of an industry trend that we're going to be seeing with identity and access management software incorporating automation more so that the organizations have that level of protection or that level of ease or that level of management automation that that perhaps they need to be able to kind of manage their identity and access management efforts more effectively, or their permissioning, or however they need to kind of segment their users, if you will.
Yeah, I think the automation's always been there. It's just it just continues to evolve, right? As the technology continues to improve, and as the software continues, or the software vendors continue to innovate and try to solve new problems, that automation continues, right? Like we can look at automated provisioning. That was something that we started way back when. That was a big deal when it first came out, being able to automate provisioning into identity stores and all that kind of stuff. And then, then we started to automate, reporting and being able to get visibility into what was going on in the infrastructure, right? With some of the compliance mandates we had, we automated some of that stuff. So there's always been automation. It's just what's that next level of like, where's it going next? And I think, Mike and I just kind of touched on that. But Mike, what do you think on that?
Yeah, we work with organizations day in and day out, and I think the challenge that we find is that people are manually providing access today, kind of guesswork, right? I think you might need this level of access, or you're a DBA, so we sort of kind of give you this level of access. And it lacks kind of a deep view into what kind of access am I actually giving you? And of that access, are there any high-risk permissions that I wasn't aware of? This is sort of a blind spot for most of the organizations we work with in the cloud infrastructure today. They're assigning permissions based on kind of some security baselines, kind of guesswork, kind of manual, right?
Yep.
And, when we do risk assessments for the organizations that we work with, is where we truly uncover where a lot of those permissions exist and what they really mean. Think about it for a moment. Within AWS, for example, you provide a user access to everything. Let's say by default, there's 9,300 permissions across a plethora of services, right? Does any administrator really understand those 9,300 permissions and what each one actually provides access to? I live and breathe this every day. I have to support AWS, GCP, VMware, AWS, right? There is so much that you have to learn day in and day out. And furthermore, these, new services are being rolled out by these cloud providers every single day too. So the baseline is constantly changing too. So by leveraging automation, which brings out, hey, these are the permissions you're using. You seem to be way over permissioned. I need to get to a level of least privileges to reduce risk. Furthermore, of the permissions I provided, you've got a number of high-risk permissions that would let you destroy a portion of the infrastructure, either intentionally or accidentally. These are some of the things that we're very prescriptive to in the organizations we work with to help them, start to incorporate automation and really bring a more automated way and a more calculated way by which they provide access.
Yeah, and there's some other things that you can do with that too, right? Like there are governance technologies that you can do access certifications and all that kind of stuff with. Micro Focus has one. We have a bunch of competitors that have them as well. But what that does is does some of the stuff that Mike was talking about. So listen, like Rob has access to these applications. Some of these are high risk. Some of them are similar to a whole bunch of other people. So we'll just automatically approve that. But the ones that are high risk, we try to get. The idea is to get the manager to approve that access right, applying levels of risk that are associated with that. What other users are similar to that user and what they should have access to. The issue with some of that is that when the managers that approve that stuff aren't made aware of why they're approving it. And what happens when I do approve it, you can get access creep and you can get the wrong level of access for users because they just what's called rubber stamping things, right? Because there wasn't the right level of information paid to it. So there are things that you can do to help with that, but again, you need to consider how you implement that within the organization to make sure everybody's kind of adhering to the same standard or understands the implications of potentially not doing it right.
All right. We just got a question in by Bob, which I think is pretty germane to this conversation. So he asked, do you think the native cloud providers are providing sound native identity security, or are they leaning heavily on the third-party vendors now to bridge those needs? You guys have a thought on that?
I think it's a combination of both. They provide a ton of Legos, right? A lot of different building blocks to provide these different layers of security, ways in which to manage identity, methods by which they're implemented. But just like, any type of marketplace, you've got a variety of different vendors that provide additional features and functionality, whether it be, automation or ML, right? Or furthermore, the ability to analyze a lot of the data generated within that cloud infrastructure provider. So whether it's AWS, Azure, GCP, et cetera, taking a lot of that data and making sense of it so you can leverage the automation, provide additional layers of security to really help you get to zero trust, least privileges, as Rob mentioned, different layers of governance as well, because that varies based on customer, right? Some customers have SOC 2 type 2 compliance, other ones have PCI compliance, HIPAA, et cetera. So, it really depends on, the climate of the customer and the characteristics of the organization to really define where those puzzle pieces really come into place. And when we work with organizations and provide that prescriptive advice, it's about how to leverage a lot of that existing technology and complement it with third party as well. So, the bottom line from my perspective is it depends, right? But the nice thing is there's a lot of different, types of capabilities out there.
Yeah, and that's exactly where I was going to go with that. It depends. Yes, they do offer stuff, but at the end of the day, it depends on the environment that it's going in, and the type of organization that's implementing it. Every organization is different. They all have different mandates or compliance protocols or whatever they have to adhere to. The stuff that's already in their infrastructure, how that needs to connect to the cloud, like all that stuff plays a bit of a part, and it comes down to the complexity. Can the Azure, AWS stuff deal with the complexity and the I don't want to say the customization, but essentially the customization that has to go into making the technology work with what the existing stack technology looks like. And I don't want to say there's an 80-20 rule there, but maybe that they can cover 80% of probably what you need. It's that other 20% that the bad guys are counting on you not doing. right? And you really got to that's what gets you over the hurdle. That's what gets you over the hump. That's what gets you to, that secured environment. That's just a little bit better than the guy down the road, so they're going to go bother him and not you. But that 20% is really what we provide, and that's the hard part. That's the part that really makes the difference to the ecosystem overall.
All right, great. So guys, if you have a question, please go ahead and use the question and answer interface or the chat interface, and we'll answer them as we go along. It was a great question.
Bob, by the way.
Thanks, Bob. That was a great question. So, you very quickly touched on zero trust, and I think we should definitely talk about zero trust and in identity and access management's role in a zero trust security environment. So, Rob, we'll start with you. Where does IAM kind of sit in zero trust, and what are some of the things that organizations need to consider if they are in that zero trust environment when it comes to IAM?
Well, of course, I'm going to say it's foundational, right?
Yes.
I'm going to say identity is foundational, but at the end of the day, it is. And the big thing with zero trust, I mean, listen, this started as a Forrester write-up a number of years ago, and I'm sure many of the attendees on the call today have gone to different websites that said they have the solution to zero trust. That's a lie. They don't. They have a solution maybe to a part of zero trust, but at the end of the day, zero trust is a program. It's something that you need to look at as a holistic component to your security posture. It's not something that you can go buy and then solve for. It's a bunch of technologies that need to work together. Identity is part of that. Managing data is part of that. Managing network security is part of that. There's all kinds of components that are part of a zero trust ecosystem. The zero trust, and Mike's going to probably go a little bit further with this, is kind of the next evolution of the concept of least privilege, right? Mm-hmm. You're trying to ensure that people or identities, not even people, any type of identity has only the access it needs, nothing more, nothing less, and you don't trust it by default. Everything has to authenticate, and it has to pass that authentication before we authorize it to do anything. But you need to look at your entire infrastructure and look at where are my gaps and apply that zero trust kind of thought process behind it to solve for zero trust. It's not something that you're going to be able to go out and buy an access solution or a network solution, and all of a sudden you have a zero trust ecosystem. That it doesn't work that way. You have to look at it kind of as a holistic type of approach, and it's probably going to take you 1 to 3 to 5 years to get there. And you need to build a roadmap and figure out we don't need to get into that, but yes, identity is core to that, because you need to know what's trying to access what's the risk associated with that. All of those things are all parts of identity, but there's other stuff that's also included that you have to consider as well. But yes, identity is a big chunk of that zero trust for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when we think about holistic, what does that really mean in today's world, right? Mm-hmm. Versus 15, 20, 25 years ago, where we built a moat around our network, and that was good enough, right? So when I think back when I was teaching ethical hacking classes 20 years ago, I started to get folks that were starting to ask me about, beyond the firewall, what else do I need to think about? And people were starting to implement additional layers of defense, right? Intrusion prevention and malware protection and all of these things. The world in which we live in today, data lives everywhere. And you've seen a lot of guidance from a lot of folks around kind of a micro focus, no pun intended, around, these different areas, where data may live on endpoints, as it has for some time, but data lives in the cloud, various types of SaaS services on your network. I mean, data lives in a lot of different areas now. So when we think about a holistic approach, rather than thinking about it solely like we have traditionally, like additional layers of defense, now we need to think about how these different data points kind of live in different areas. I think in addition, we're sort of at an interesting evolution in the cloud, for example, and that is people, I think, largely have thought about it from a perimeter standpoint, but now they're thinking beyond that. If we take a note of a lot of the recent breaches, it's been exposures around over provisioned access. And that ties directly back to identity and access management. And when we break that down, we're thinking about, identities and their access to resources, right? And so that needs to be broken down, from that perspective of, what type of access am I providing to resources, but also very importantly, and this is a tie back to the holistic approach, where do those resources live, right? And that really needs to be mapped out, because again, we no longer live in this world of creating a moat around our environment. Right. Data lives everywhere. So understanding where those resources are and then how I'm providing access, and furthermore, breaking down the different types of permissions and understanding those, you can see already there's a lot of additional layers that need to be understood in order to protect.
Yeah, I mean, on top of that, identities have evolved beyond heartbeats, right? It's no longer like when we talked about that kind of perimeter moat idea. It was all about individuals. It was people that you're trying to manage. Now it's, devices and things. They all have access. They're all, contributing to the data that you have or accessing the data you have. So that whole concept of providing that right level of access is not just from an individual standpoint. It's from all of the other, non-human types of identities that you're managing as well, right? It just adds to that complexity, which goes back to a bit of the question that Bob asked earlier. Do those, is the identity in those cloud infrastructures enough? Well, again, it's that complexity level.
Right. It's also, when we're talking about identities, it's not like what you just said, Robert. It's not just people, but it's also devices, and it's also the other data sources. And I have a feeling that one of the biggest issues that organizations are having is just understanding what it is that's on the network, or what attaches to the network, that needs to have that certain permission to do something, and that's got to be probably one of the largest issues around identity and access management today. And so, to your point earlier, automation, I'm sure, could help quite a bit in just the permissioning part, and making sure that the right devices have the right access, and the right people too also have the right access at the right time. Now, with the number of different permissions that we're now seeing with the cloud services providers, Mike, have you guys noticed there being any, particular areas in which organizations are having more trouble with provisioning or permissioning, and maybe over permissioning or under permissioning, and and is that a direct result of the fact that cloud providers maybe aren't being as proactive in helping organizations with their permissioning and their identity and access management, maybe to the extent that they should, or is it a lack of education, or what are we looking at?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that whether it's AWS, Azure, GCP, et cetera, they always mention that it's a shared model, right? There's certain layers of protection that they provide, and how you implement it, and those additional layers is kind of the ownership on your side as well, right? So when we kind of take note of that, and we think about things such as automation, the flip side of that is, remember that, for example, in the cloud, automation, the ability to build a stack, the ability to build that infrastructure so quickly, also hinges on automation. And furthermore, when we think about identity, it's more than just human, it's non-human as well. Today, service accounts, those types of things outnumber human 5-1 already, and it's expected in the next few years it'll be 20-1. So when assessing your environment, when determining how to manage all of that, also want to take a look at all of those non-human accounts that are being used in a very automated way, and what permissions they're using as well. We've seen in a number of breaches where that's being exploited too, So at the end of the day, whose responsibility is it? Again, it's sort of a shared model, right? But it's the organization that's in the driver's seat in determining, how that is all managed based on a whole plethora of characteristics we've mentioned so far, and really thinking about identities and their access to resources, and leveraging automation to really provide a much better calculated way in which that's managed. So, I mean, just to add one more thing, are we seeing over permissioned access? Yes. I mean, one of the statistics we see when we do risk assessments every day for organizations, the average user is using less than 1% of the permissions they've been given. So clearly there's a systemic problem with over permissioned access. And as a result, it becomes really, really key to understand where that over permissioned access exists. A lot of it really stems from activity. So taking note of what activity is going on and what permissions people are actually using becomes a very, fundamental way by which you can, pull back that over permissioned access and really do it in a very calculated way. Then you can also start to think about, hey, do they have high risk permissions they shouldn't have and those other things. But it seems the organizations we're working with are finding that that's a really good starting point in trying to get to least privileges.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of directions that we could go with this, but the permissions are a big one, the policies that are written are a big one, the identity types are a big one, and then being able to look at all those to see kind of what I have and how many are being unused or used infrequently. Those like you can look at that stuff and try to make some sense out of it. Going back to being over permissioned and is it the cloud vendor's fault or not? I mean, it'd be like you giving me your debit card with the PIN number, and I went and took money out of your account and then gave you back the card without the money. You can't go to the bank and say, well, hey, it's like, yeah, but you gave them the PIN number. That's not my fault. You know what I mean? It's
as much as we would like to be able to do that.
Like it's not their fault that you didn't manage the identities properly, right?
Right.
But one of the big ones we see are the elevated privileges within privileged identities, and that's all for the most part with any organization we walk into is all low hanging fruit because they don't have a good sense and a good management of their privileges. A lot of users are overprivileged. There's very few, if any, that are ever underprivileged, but certainly they're all overprivileged, and they're not managing them in a way that is driving any value to the organization. There's so much exposure there that if somebody had happened to get a hold of one of those credentials, or somebody just decided, I hate this place, I'm going to start stealing data, that there's not a whole lot that organizations have put into place to try to manage and control those elevated privileges in a way that drives the level of security they think they have. That's a key component. Mm-hmm. They think they have it, but in actuality, that's not the case.
Okay. What about compliance? When we're talking about this greater topic of identity and access, obviously there are many regulations out there regarding who has access to what data and the possibility that data could be breached, and how we're supposed to basically be protecting personal information. So identity and access management as it pertains to regulatory compliance, what's been happening in that space, and have you guys noticed that IAM is actually as we are seeing this increase in permissioning and maybe even over permissioning, that compliance is becoming a larger part of the conversation?
Well, you can take a look at that on two sides of the fence, right? You can look at it from an internal perspective in terms of how the identities are being managed internally. And then there's also the external stuff with the customer identity access management and all the privacy stuff that goes along with that. So one of the reasons why we continue to talk about identity and access management is that very topic that you brought up, are all these rules and regulations that we have to adhere to. And that has a direct impact on the way in which organizations have to manage identity and access management. When you look at a lot of them, the core component is access and how you grant access and what happens when you grant. Like all of that stuff is all part of this, and it's a driver for our organizations, mine and Mike's, to go in and talk to customers because they're struggling to meet with the demands that these things are putting on them as an organization, and how they have to restructure their environment to be able to meet the demands that have just been put on them. GDPR was a big one, and now we've got a whole bunch of stuff going on with basically carbon copy of GDPR in California, and we got something in Canada. Like all of those things are impacting the way in which we have to manage not only identities, but the data that's associated with them as well, right? So having customers say that, yeah, you can use this data for whatever purposes, or no, you can't. I don't want you to email me. I don't want you to talk to me unless I talk to you. You have to be able to manage all of that stuff, ensure that you're following those regulations, because if you don't, there's big fines that can happen with that. But that continues to push identity and access management in a whole bunch of different ways.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, all of the organizations we work with are has some level of compliance that they need to be in line with. It may be regulatory or industry compliances. And thinking about identity and access management in that context, some of what is still common today is the ability to assess that and understand the security hygiene across your identity and access management. So the context around not only how over permissioned you are, high risk permissions, those things, but understanding other characteristics around how could the environment be exploited, right? And there are lots of discussions around toxic combinations of permissions, and at the end of the day, compliance is also about improving your security hygiene, right? When we think about HIPAA, when we think about PCI compliance, when we think about SOC 2 Type 2, or we think about the security baselines, so maybe AWS well-architected, CIS benchmarks, NIST 800-53, there are all, ways in which you can kind of assess, evaluate, and report on, what your security hygiene looks like, but also that you're improving that over time. And that becomes really important when you get to audits, right? Is that you're constantly iterating on that, improving upon that, and you've got a plan. Yeah. So, when mapping that back to identity and access management, there's a lot of characteristics about how do people get to resources, through what means, right? Is it direct? Is it indirect? How's the application defined? What type of resources sit out there on the inside or the outside? Are these public or private? Are they encrypted or not? So there's a lot of different characteristics to look at. But again, it's the ability to, assess that, report on that, and figure out how you're going to iterate on that and improve that and demonstrate that over time.
Okay. All right.
And I mean, a lot of those, the ones you mentioned earlier, SOX, PCI, all that stuff largely became a thing because we weren't managing identities properly, right? And we weren't doing the proper hygiene, as Mike mentioned earlier. And once that was discovered, that's why these things kind of came to be, to make sure that we were doing the right things. And again, that just continues to evolve, right? Much like the automation thing that we talked about earlier. And that's why we now have stuff like GDPR too.
So, last year, I keep coming back to the pandemic, but it's kind of such an important part of the security conversation in general. But last year, when all these companies switched to remote work immediately, almost overnight, they admittedly let a lot of their security policies kind of opened up their networks, if you will, and they just, because they wanted to make sure that their employees were able to work effectively, and that their customers were able to conduct transactions in a very high level, user engagement way. So, do you guys think that identity and access management, some of the ways that they went ahead and opened their networks, do you think that that had kind of a negative impact on maybe the being able to meet compliance, because their networks were so open, and to your point, I think you mentioned earlier that you're going to write a blog post or something like that about the fact that we're a year later, and thank goodness we've not seen any real major issues as a result of it. But do you think that there was any impact at all on the way that organizations approach security at the top of the pandemic, and whether we're going to see some blowback maybe in time regarding the fact that they were not within compliance for any particular time period because of that?
Mike,
So
you
I
want to
think,
start? Yeah.
oh, go ahead, Rob.
Well, no, I was going to say you start.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, if we get back to kind of where we started in the conversation, it was, the pace at which people are moving to the cloud.
Yeah.
It's clear, some organizations were ill prepared for that, but they needed to move quickly to adapt to the pandemic and everything that was going on, and the fact that they were going to have lots of folks working from home, and that this evolution was going to happen much quicker than we anticipated. Just due to situationally what was going on.
Mhm.
As a result, I think that there have been a lot of interesting challenges, right? If we take note of what's going on in the security climate today, between solar winds, between what has happened with so many other different topical events that are going on today, that there was a big blind spot for a lot of organizations when it came to that, right? And Microsoft and others are very prescriptive in terms of how people should be locking things down. Unfortunately, sometimes we have to learn from these events to better learn how to improve our security hygiene in general. So I think when we think about that evolution, how it's happened quickly, I think a lot of folks are looking more to automation, machine learning, anomaly analysis, user behavioral analysis to complement how they've been doing things today, because the pace of the cloud is moving so quickly. The pandemic pushed us to move workloads to the cloud so quickly, and we're taking note of the fact that cloud is moving so fast that from a human perspective, can we really keep pace with all of this? And so I think it lends credence to why people are embracing these technologies. I don't know. Do you have anything to add, Rob?
Yeah, listen. Before the pandemic, a lot of organizations thought about work as someplace you are, not something you do, right? And to go to work meant that you had to get up and drive to an office, and then overnight it was like, well, now work is just something I do anywhere. And I think it was more getting over that mental hurdle. The infrastructures themselves, I think, were resilient enough to be able to manage the shift, to allow people to work remotely. Yes, they needed to go buy additional tokens or whatever, some sort of advanced authentication method. There was some expenditure and some hurdles that they had to open up the bigger bandwidth to get people in and out of infrastructures, and in and out of the network, or on and off the network. There were many organizations that said, okay, get up in the morning, download whatever you needed, and then disconnect, because we need to make sure there's enough throughput for people to do actual day-to-day stuff where they need to remain connected all the time. For the most part, those were the major hurdles. It wasn't that we weren't secure. Now, is there going to be something that auditors are going to come along and find and go, whoa, you guys weren't doing the right thing? Yeah, probably. But that could be said any day.
Right.
But I think for the most part, organizations did a hell of a job getting remote workforces put into place and still secure. Because listen, at the end of the day, it doesn't. When you look at the security protocols that organizations have in place, it doesn't matter if you're on-prem or working home. The rules should still apply. Should be the concept of least privilege. You should only have access to what you should, and nothing more, nothing less. Like, that doesn't change just because all of a sudden you moved and now you're working from home and not in an office, right? The way in which you connect, you have to make sure that that's secured. I'm oversimplifying it. But for the most part, I think that, yes, we were able to do that without a whole lot of issue because of the way in which the security had been applied. It just applied in a different way. They're still doing governance. You're still doing, risk-based you're still doing authentication. Whether it's risk-based, that's a whole other issue. We'll talk about that maybe on another call. But for the most part, the basics still applied. But did it show that we need to move things to the cloud, and that we needed to make it easier for people to work remotely? 100%. That's still gonna happen. That's still gonna change, and we're still gonna see the impact of that as we continue. Because at the end of the day, we all know that we can do our work easier now that we're working from home, right? Than we did maybe driving in and all that kind of stuff. So, organizations from a security standpoint still have to consider that ease of use. So people will be more secure as a net result because they'll want to adopt whatever you're putting into place. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, I think organizations did a great job. That we saw very little in terms of breaches or any major security hiccups because people are working remotely. Knock on wood. But for the most part, I think everybody did a pretty good job.
Okay. All right, great. We just got a question in from Ricardo, who has got an interesting question. What open source projects are helping improving managing security, and what's special about them?
There's all kinds of access ones. You want to go with that, Mike?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there are a number of open source projects. I mean, related to identity and access management. We've seen a number of tools that allow the ability to assess that access, and I'm a big believer, in this open source movement, right? I present frequently at conferences like DEF CON, and a lot of the genesis behind conferences like that, in my humble opinion, is to help drive security and the many open source tools that people release, and sharing their research and helping push everyone forward in terms of continuing to think about the risks that are out there, and how to embrace a lot of that open source software that may be out there. So there are a number of tools that I use day in and day out, in assessing identities and access, and they really provide a lot of ability in identifying and assessing where do those risks exist, and how access is provided, and it does it in a quick and efficient manner for the different platforms that you may be working with. So I find myself leveraging GitHub and many of those other forums, right, for gaining access to that open source code.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the open source stuff allows us to push, or has allowed us to push the digital transformation faster, because we're able to use a lot of that technology in a way that enables us to connect to get users in from a social media login and things along those lines, right? So that open source kind of technology enabled us to connect old technologies with new technologies, and it's something that was consistent and wasn't proprietary, so nobody had to pay to make that transition. It just worked. It's kind of like, are you an Apple or an Android person? It's like, well, you have to buy into either one, and the two don't really talk very well to one another, and one's more expensive than the other, and one has better features than the other, depending upon what side of that fence you stand on. But at the end of the day, in some cases, it's limiting, right? But the open source projects allowed us to push things forward without those limitations, because everybody owned it. You didn't have to pay for it, and it enabled you to connect so many things to new technologies, new devices, new things, new services, in a way that you got expected results every time, right? And that's not necessarily the case with proprietary stuff. That tends to be a little more expensive. It can be heavy. It can be just gross to deal with. I mean, I'm one of those vendors, so not that I'm trying to shoot myself, but at the end of the day, that open source stuff really did help us push that digital transformation a lot faster than it would have been otherwise.
Yeah, one thing I would add is I've always looked at it personally as a lead, by example, right? And a lot of times, you may be screaming from the rooftops that, hey, you need to do this for security, you need to do that. But many times people demonstrate that and lead by example by releasing some new open source software, presenting it at many of the conferences I attend or present at, like a DEF CON or many of the other shows. And it's very transformational in terms of how people think about certain very specific types of risk, including identity and access management and access to so many different resources that we have. So I think it's a great thing, and I hope that everybody continues to embrace it.
Yeah. I mean, we need way more of it, right? It'd be great if there was just one way. Like we have all these IoT devices that are floating around. They all have different logins and, you know, platform. Like nothing unifies that. There isn't one way of doing it. Everybody has their own way. And now I've got 17 apps on my phone instead of maybe just one that controls it all, which would be awesome. And that's kind of what open source does, right? It gives you that single thing that everybody can use and leverage and benefit from, instead of using, you know, 17 different ways of doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, quick time check. We're about 6 minutes to the top of the hour. So before we shut things down, I wanted to kind of maybe take a look at the landscape, maybe what's ahead for identity and access management. What are some of the things that you guys are seeing now and coming down the road in the IAM space that organizations maybe need to kind of think about as they go on their zero trust journey or are just looking specifically at IAM technology? So Mike, why don't you go ahead and get us started with that?
Yeah, I'd say there's two interesting things that I see going on. One is, you know, around just-in-time access, privilege on demand, those types of things. That you'll find that native to a lot of the cloud infrastructure providers, right? But how I still think about providing that access, while I can now provide a portal and a method by which I can give out those permissions, and also have a way for attestation and audit trail, you know, around that. So I've given out that access and there's an audit trail for all of that. Is still, how do I calculate a really good way in which to provide that access? That's always been the challenge, right? It's kind of guesswork, kind of manual, a little bit of security baselines. It's sort of like a melting pot of all of that, you know? So it begs the need for automation and calculation of, you know, how do I exactly provide the exact right type of permissions? And a lot of that can be based on activity and understanding, you know, you're only using 1% of the permissions assigned. And so privilege on demand, in my humble opinion, kind of morphs from, okay, so you can use it to provide access, but now that you've gone through the process of setting least privileges, how do I provide new access? So I've removed those 99% worth of permissions, but now you're a developer, you're working on a new project, I need to give you that additional access. That calculation based on activity now is something that you can use as a template for providing new forms of access that are much more accurate, right? The other thing that we see going on is people are just starting to think about, you know, beyond resources, and now more and more kind of from a data governance and a data level perspective now too. People are just starting to think about that. Everyone's at different stages, but we're starting to get questions around data governance in the cloud, right? And how to manage security around that, set appropriate policies, things like that. Those are the two things that we see going on right now. To you, Rob.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's about looking at, you know, each and every activity and then measuring it against some sort of level of risk, and then based on whatever that risk assessment is of that activity, determining how we should authenticate and authorize that user. Do they need to do step-up authentication, you know, whatever, and then as they continue through their journey, you know, tracking what they're doing. And ensuring that, you know, as they continue to move through the infrastructure and they try to access other things, that we're still constantly monitoring and measuring. It's not a matter of, you know, authenticating them and then just letting them go. It's like you would never let somebody in your house and then go upstairs without you. Like, why would you do that? So you want to track them, right? So there's certainly that. The other part to it is that we collect so much data on identities as they kind of traverse the infrastructure that we were collecting it, but we weren't really able to do anything with it. We talked a lot about big data many years ago, and that was a thing. But we didn't really have technologies that was able to leverage the data that we were collecting to make sense out of it. So now what we're seeing is with user behavior analytics and, you know, kind of this artificial intelligence component to it, is that we're able to make sense of the data that we're collecting. We're able to look at identities that are similar to one another to try to, again, make our own baseline based on what we're seeing of those identities and what they're doing. Mike talked earlier about, people only using 1% of the permissions they have, or less than 1%. So that would be a good thing to know. So if all the identity types are only using 1% of those permissions, but then all of a sudden you have one that's using 15 of them, well, then we might want to go do a little bit more research on that, right? It's about being able to find the things that we don't know exist, because up until now, security was all about trying to prevent the things we did know. But there was all kinds of stuff that we didn't know. And this whole collection of data and being able to look at, what the identities are doing, you're able to look for those anomalies that you didn't even know existed, and then be able to prevent that next time, right? So it's always that reiteration. So you see something, then you make sure that that doesn't happen again, right? So it's about using that technology and that artificial intelligence and those analytics to be able to really harden your security posture. That's where we see things going.
Awesome. Well, guys, we are 1 minute to end. So I want to thank you guys for what a great conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. Rob and Mike, thank you both so much. Before we close things up, though, I do want to do the drawing for the $425 Amazon gift card. So let's get that done real quick. Our winners today are Bob D, Matt W, Ricardo S, and Laura V. Congratulations to all 4 of you. We are going to be sending you an email that contains your Amazon gift card. So check your inbox. If you don't see it there, please check your spam folder. Again, Rob and Mike, thank you so much for our conversation today. Lots and lots of really great information. I do appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having us. I had a great time and great questions too. Thank you.
Yeah, all right, great. I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody. Please stay safe.